Hey guys, welcome to the first of, I hope, a series of Vohra Method Training videos for new teachers, for established teachers, just ways for us to make sure we're focusing on the right methods and the things that are going to do the best both for our students and really help them improve as quickly and as effectively and psychologically strongly as possible. This video I'm going to talk about hints because it is, one of the biggest and most difficult areas for all of us, and it's, something that's hard for me too. Even I make some of these mistakes that I'm going to talk about in this video. And so let's start with the basic idea. Why we don't do hints. In general, hints slow people down. Maybe not at first. And the ideal situation is that you might get a short-term gain for a long-term loss. So a short-term gain means that you might give a hint that helps a student do problem 1. But even though problem 1 is done quicker, now the rest of the program is going to end up taking much longer. Here's why. The student is now thinking, instead of about relying on himself and figuring stuff out, is now spending their time and energy strategizing on how to get the answer from you. And so that means there's going to be a lot of delays. The other thing is sometimes that hint that you give might actually make it so that we don't spend the right amount of time building an important fundamental. So instead of building that fundamental, let's say it's at level 1 and we need to get to level 10, maybe it only gets to level 2. And then it seems that it's far enough because they get through it with the hint. We need to make sure that they can get through it without the hint. And so that means that the ideal situation is you're going to get that long-term loss, as in everything takes much longer because the fundamentals, both the academic fundamentals and the psychological fundamentals, are not developed strongly enough. And by psychological fundamentals, I mean perseverance, self-reliance, all those things that we're trying to teach. More commonly, though, you're going to get a short-term loss and also a long-term loss. Here's what happens. People will misinterpret the hint, and then you have to give a hint for the hint. Or that hint is going to send them in a path that for you is the most direct, but might be very different from how they're thinking about it at the time. And so the result is going to be, the result often is that a problem that without a hint would have taken 10 minutes, with a hint ends up taking 20 minutes. So because of that, we're going to try to just not really give any direct hints of any kind. Now let's talk about a few other types of hints. When it comes to shortcuts, you should never teach a shortcut. Ever. This is the biggest area where this is going to come up is factoring. Because in factoring, you're going to want to say, like, well, here's how you do this type of factoring. And you say, like, find numbers that do this and find numbers that add up to this or multiply out to this or whatever. When you do that, the result is that they might learn that one skill more quickly, but they're losing the ability to figure stuff out, which is the ability we're trying to teach. Remember, factoring is not important particularly for itself. It's important as a way to have students develop problem-solving skills. Factoring is really good for that because you have to kind of guess and check and figure stuff out and develop your own systems and figure out how to do the thing. That's what we want students to be able to do. So instead of giving a shortcut saying, like, here's a clever way to do it, let them figure it out. And if they figure out the shortcuts on their own, that's totally fine. And a lot of times we'll actually require that. You remember in Math Paths that there's one of the problems where the students are required to figure out how to do the problem in one step. That's kind of requiring them to figure out a shortcut. That's totally good, but that's very different from teaching a shortcut. We should never teach a shortcut. Even something like the quadratic formula. Why do we have the Proving the Quadratic Formula worksheet? Because we don't tell people the quadratic formula. We have them derive it and develop the skills to derive it. Remember, we need to make sure that we're constantly hammering home this message, that math is not following instructions. Math is not just doing stuff that you're told to do. Math is figuring out how to solve something unfamiliar. It is learning to face and overcome the unknown. It is learning to create and think beyond yourself. It's not important by itself. None of this math actually matters by itself. It's only there as a tool to build these kind of psychological and cognitive and perseverance skills. So let's talk about the type of hints to specifically avoid, because, and this is the one that we all fall into. I fall into this one all the time, so I'm going to come clean with you guys. I make this mistake too, and I'm going to be working with you guys to not make this mistake. You should never begin a hint. If a hint starts with the word think about or consider or something like that, that's not going to be a good hint. It's always a well-intentioned hint, and it always seems like it's going to work, but it doesn't. Here's why. It's going to make the problem harder because students are going to misinterpret the hint. When students first come in for reading, especially, they can't read and they can't think, like at all. So if you say to think about this, they're going to misinterpret what you say, all right? And so now they have to worry about interpreting what you say, which is outside of their range. And then they also have to at the same time figure out what the passage is saying. It creates just a lot of conflict, and it makes things take much longer than it needs to. At the same time as adding to the time, it sets the wrong precedent. Because now they're expecting you to always kind of push them in some direction or another. You shouldn't be pushing them in any direction at all. Our job is to put forward obstacles that they overcome, and each obstacle should be a little bit higher than the previous one. It shouldn't be 50 times higher, just a tiny bit higher. Now, if you help them too much through the first 10 obstacles, then they've never faced an obstacle that's going to prepare them for the 11th obstacle. The idea is these should all be building upon each other. Of course, if you spot a situation where it seems like obstacle 5 is a million times higher than obstacle 4, immediately bring that to my attention and to Chelsea's attention. Let's think about where a student's focus needs to be. We want our students 100% focused on figuring out the problem. They should be not at all focused on trying to get the answer out of you. If they're spending 90% of their energy trying to get you to give them a hint, then they're not spending that energy where it should be. So it says over here, we're not trying to replace direct instruction with, kind of cryptic or indirect instruction. That's not what we want to do. We're trying to replace didactic obedience masquerading as education with real education. That's Socratic style self-reliance built on questions and obstacles and all that kind of stuff. All right, so now I want to talk about some examples. Let's look at some of the first few worksheets that we do. I'm going to start with analyzing assumptions. The only hint we should have in that whole worksheet is that on the cows, the dogs are green, and that one, the hint should be the answer is going to be an if-then statement, and you should give that after 5 guesses, and that's the only hint on that whole worksheet, except for the hints that are actually written into the worksheet. Other problems should not get any direct hints at all. As an example, where do we often see this especially difficult? We're going to see that in the problem with Debbie, with the magician and all that kind of stuff. You're going to want to give hints on that one because it's so difficult and it just seems to take so long. When you're looking at when you're in that problem, the first thing you should do is just say look at the hints for that problem that are already written. Let's say that isn't working for some reason. Let's say that the student can't do any of the hints or is totally stuck. Then ideally you should probably go to a drop down. Let's say you're doing a problem and there is no drop down. Let's say you're doing a reading worksheet especially and there's no drop down. First, mention that to both me and Chelsea, or if just one of us is there, just mention that right away, and try to email both of us because that means that there's a problem within the curriculum that we need to correct. But a general thing to do when a student seems completely stuck on a reading problem is to realize they're probably not seeing the words on the page. That's the most common thing. Even adults do this. Everyone does this. So you'll just miss words that are entirely there. So what you do in those problems is you should encourage students or not encourage, you should tell students to tell you what the sentence means. or what a particular word means, or just what all the words mean. And again, we're trying to refocus a student on the actual problem, on the actual sentence. For a lot of people, when they're under pressure, they're going to have a lot, especially if they have a lot of anxiety, they might have blurred vision and things like that. So they might literally not be seeing a thing. So if you ask them what a specific word means, that at least gets them focused back on the actual words on the page, instead of just like having some sort of a, panic attack or something like that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what about, hints in math. This is a mistake that I also make, especially. In the first mathematical paths problem, we often want to say try factoring. Because it so often works, and it seems like it's not going to, it works often, and it doesn't seem like it's that big a deal. Here's the problem. That sets the wrong precedent. That lets people know that they are going to maybe get a worksheet, maybe have to figure it out, or maybe get a hint. That's wrong. We want them to know the choices are figure out or worksheet. That's the idea of those cognitive incentives, which means your brain should always have the incentive to try to figure it out. The alternative to figuring it out should always be worse. It should be worksheets. So it should be that if you focus hard on figuring it and figure it out, then you don't have to do the worksheet. It should never be that if you can't focus a little bit and can't figure it out, then you get a hint. That creates a backwards incentive. The incentive should always be the harder you focus, the less work you do, not the less you focus, the more hints you get. We cannot create that backwards incentive. And that precedent has to be set with the first problem on the first worksheet. And so instead of saying, try factoring, give them the factoring inspection. That's why we made the factoring inspection in the first place. It's shorter than the long factoring worksheet, and it verifies whether the student can do the factoring or not. And it serves as kind of an indirect hint anyway. It gets the point across that they should try factoring, but it also gets the point across that if they don't figure a thing out, then they'll have to do more work, and that has to be said right at the beginning. Now, let's go back to some of the reading hints. Like, what do we do with reading hints? So when you're asking a question in reading, and this is really important, when you're asking a reading hint question, and hint questions are fine, but they need to be very simple and very specific. It can be, what does this word mean? What does this sentence mean? It should not be something like, what does the first sentence apply about the underlying motivations? Because that by itself is just too big. That question would be its own main sequence question with its own set of hints. If you're talking about words, you should say, what does the word egalitarian mean? That's a good question. It should not be something like, what does the use of the word egalitarian imply about the author's mindset? That's not a hint question. That's a primary main sequence question that should be in its own worksheet. That's a big, huge thing. That should not be something that we just kind of ad-lib over there. If a student is stuck, go to a responsive worksheet or to a drop-down worksheet. If there is no responsive or drop-down worksheet, or you just don't happen to know what it's called, immediately let me and Chelsea or whoever you're working with know. There's a good chance that there is a drop-down worksheet that it might be a less common worksheet. Maybe it isn't something that you've worked with yet. That's fine. But just let us know, and we'll either say what drop-down worksheet to use, or we'll know that we need to immediately make a new drop-down worksheet. And that's often the case. A lot of these worksheets come from problems we see in class, and we fix that. You should also, at that point is where you can start asking questions if it's reading about what words mean, about what sentences mean, to get a sense of where the student is. If a student doesn't know what any of the words mean in a sentence or a passage, then that by itself is a situation that needs to be addressed. And usually it's going to be addressed very simply by working directly on vocabulary. What does this word mean? Use it in a sentence, like just using those definition worksheets that we have for that purpose. And again, that's because students are often, sometimes they know the definition of the words, they're just not seeing the words. And this is a very common problem. Not seeing a word, one of the most common difficulties in reading. When we're doing hints, when we're adding hints, new hints, those should be considered outside of class. They should be discussed, and they shouldn't just be ad-libbed in the moment. When we're working with 15 different students, it's not the time, that's not the right mind space to come up with a hint on the fly. that should be discussed afterwards. And it should also be immediately mentioned to either Chelsea or to me or realistically to both. Let's say that there's a situation in which a student has done the hints, but they still can't do the question. You need to let either me or Chelsea or ideally both know. That means that either the way we're presenting it needs to be reworked, the hints need to be changed, something needs to be done. It shouldn't just, it's not something that we just ad-lib and then forget about, because then we're starting to rely on ad-libbing. And we, as an organization, should not be relying on ad-libbing for something this complex. When we're doing simultaneous tutoring with many students who are struggling on different issues, that should be prepared in advance. We shouldn't be expecting to be ad-libbing in the moment. That's never the right solution in a high-speed parallel tutoring program. That doesn't make any sense. And not to say that's not meant to criticize anybody, because I do it just as much as everybody else does, but it's a thing that we should not be doing. It's not going to be a good way to strengthen the program. So we should, even though we all give into it from time to time, let's bring that time to time back down to 0. Finally, I want to mention this. It's totally good to talk to students. We chat with them on Skype, and that's different from giving a hint. So it's good to build that rapport, that camaraderie, all that kind of stuff. If it seems like it's the right time to do it, don't force it or anything. We're not trying to be distracting. So, for example, if a student's really struggling with something, you can encourage them. You can remind them how important the thing is. You can say, factoring is the most important part of algebra. You can talk about how you really need to know the unit circle for pre-cal, for calculus, for graphing, sine, whatever. So that's good. But you see, you can do all of that without giving a hint. You can do all of that without trying to lead them to the answer. Final point, which I forgot to mention a little earlier. One of the main things to avoid are borderline rhetorical questions that are kind of designed to drag a student to the answer. That's not how it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to be dragging them. You're supposed to be putting forward obstacles of increasing difficulty, of gradually increasing difficulty, that they overcome, not that you drag them over. Because if you are constantly dragging them over, all they're learning how to do is how to be dragged. That's not what we're trying to teach. We're trying to teach self-reliance, independence of thought, cognitive perseverance, psychological perseverance, putting these skills together. So even when you're asking a question, that question shouldn't be some, basically rhetorical question designed to get them over the hurdle. If they need to struggle, let them struggle over that hurdle for an hour so that they don't have to struggle on the next hurdle for 6.5 years. And that's the most important thing. Our program is building cognitive fortitude, is building self-reliance, is building all of these things. It's not just how can I get the person past this question as fast as possible. That's not going to be a long-term gain, and it's realistically not even going to be a short-term gain either. If we want to get our students through this program quickly, we have to think about long-term gains, and those long-term gains only come from building self-reliance, from building independence of thought, from building the cognitive skills of figuring out unfamiliar problems, not the skill of just being dragged over each obstacle by the teacher one after the other. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you find it instructive, and we'll have, hopefully, a few more of these videos coming up soon.